All right, we're ready to get started again. We are set up, and I'm happy to turn the mic over to Tanya Means to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Jennifer. So first of all, welcome everybody. This is our ninth, Randy, is it ninth interface that we've done? We have been eighth, next year. We've been very, very excited about the turnout and the participation that we've had for Interface, and it's been a fabulous experience being involved in the planning of that process and helping to make this come about. Prior to when we were planning this interface, I had the opportunity to talk to Jared Stein from Instructure, and I was just impressed by how much he understands the things that are going on from our perspective as far as the things that we need, but also has the technical understanding of how to make them happen, and then the pedagogical understanding of why they need to happen. And so we were so excited that he agreed to come here and present to us. And he's been with Instructure for a while. How many years?
5 years
5 years.
Yeah.
And then before that it was working in higher ed, but about 10 to 12 years. So he has a lot of understanding of what we need, and we're really appreciative that he's here to present to us about student-centered assessment. Thanks, Jerry.
Yeah. Thanks, Tanya. One minor correction. I never fully understand what people need, so I've trained myself to always listen and to try to understand and ask a lot of questions, and that's one of the motivators behind the presentation today. Let me ask you guys a question to start off with, and this is real, like you raise your hand and answer. Why do our students care about assessments? Question, right? They want A's. They want grades. Yeah, another answer. We've trained them to need grades. Okay, 2 grades. Yes? It provides feedback. Oh yeah. Yeah, I've talked with students who, even if they have a pretty, I would say, shallow perception of what assessment is for, they do recognize that even the grade itself is a proxy for feedback. But feedback is critical. Any other ideas? Why do students care about assessment? Do they? I mean, I could have just asked that. Do they care about assessments? I need one more hand. Do they care about assessments, and why? Yes, sir.
I've heard students say that it kind of validates the work they put into it to know put time in as well.
Yeah, it validates the work that they put into learning. It creates a milestone for the learning path and some kind of recognition of their accomplishment. Well, it's such an important question. We're going to come back to that student perspective in a moment. I love assessments, and not just because I'm an education nerd, but because through my life and through my learning and through my career especially, I've learned that assessment is critical to progress, and any kind of advances that I make personally or with my team or even for us as a company is based upon some kind of assessment. So here are some of the, I think, more meaningful things about assessment that we care about, and that I would dare say we probably want our students to think about. If students look at the assessments that we give them and they recognize that those assessments are meaningful in ways such as this, it measures our progress and our outcomes. It provides us that useful feedback, but also it promotes deeper learning. That assessment itself is not just a measure, but assessment itself is a learning activity, whether it's summative or formative. And finally, that assessment prepares us for our future, which can feel like a stretch when you consider that a lot of the assessments that you probably took, like me, were multiple choice tests, essay tests, exams like that. It's sometimes hard to connect the practice of assessment to preparing students for the future, but I want to go there. I want to look at some ways that we can make assessments do that. So I ask why do students care about assessment? Because if we want to make assessment more meaningful for our students, we have to look at our assessment through the eyes of our students. And John Hattie, who's an education researcher out of University of Melbourne in Australia, he's well known for his work that synthesized over 800 meta-analyses, research works that took a number of different research studies on a related topic and tried to synthesize those. So he synthesized the syntheses of work on teaching and learning and student achievement, and he summarized those results in a book that he calls Visible Learning, and that's actually the name of the model that he has developed or interpreted from those meta-analyses. And visible learning is defined by John Hattie as this. It's, number one, when teachers see learning through the eyes of students. And we've already started that, right? We asked ourselves, why do students care about assessment? But also, when students see themselves as their own teacher. And that second part, I think it's maybe even more important than the first in terms of getting to the heart of what we sometimes call student-centered learning. Now, a couple of years ago, the research team that I worked with at Instructure, we took a look at this phrase, student-centered learning, and dug into the research literature to try to understand exactly what people were talking about, how it was put into practice, and what the results of student-centered teaching could be on students. And there are dozens of different interpretations of this phrase, student-centered learning or student-centered teaching, and even student-centered assessments. But we did find one commonality amongst all of this work, and that's that every effort to make teaching more student-centered pointed at the goal of developing our students into self-directed lifelong learners, which makes a lot of sense. And when we think about our students' experience in school, from kindergarten or pre-kindergarten, first grade, second grade, lower left-hand corner, they're working in a high-structured, teacher-directed environment. And that's, except kindergarten, actually, that's pretty low structure. But that's because they don't necessarily have the self-regulation, the ability to direct their own learning. But hopefully, by the time they're done with their education, whether that's high school or college or graduate school, they're fully able to self-direct their own learning. And they're able to thrive in the kinds of low-structure environments that we not only thrive in, but also really, really value. So developing students in a direction that leads to, developing students towards self-directed lifelong learning as a goal of student-centered learning is one thing that we can keep in mind as we look at assessment and find ways of making assessment more meaningful. So the topic of this presentation is how do we make our assessments more student-centered? How can we even simplify student-centered assessment? And three ways emerge in research literature that I want to talk about. And I'm going to briefly explain each idea. There's some references that you guys can look at later if you want, but I'm not going to go too deep on that. I mostly want to focus on not only the idea, but how it's interpreted or how it can be applied using software like Canvas. So I'll use some examples from Canvas. And then at the end, if we have time, I'm going to show you a preview of some of the work that is currently underway for what we call quizzes.next, or our next quizzing engine. So, all right, three ways here. De-stress assessment, turn assessment into active learning and make assessment authentic and meaningful. There's so many different ways to do each of these. I've picked some of my favorite examples, both from instructors that I know, faculty who I've seen present, things that I've read online. So there's so much to build from, and I hope you'll be able to take some inspiration from some of these examples. All right. So remember, we want to put ourselves in the shoes of our students. We want to look at assessment from the perspective of our students. And this is kind of where my mind goes first. You think about the stress related to assessment. And you can think about some research that recognizes that stress in students can have consequences on both learning and on their assessment performance. Stress by itself, as cited here, has some far-reaching consequences on our ability to learn and remember. Now, stress isn't always bad. Stress is sometimes good. It's what I call constructive pressure when it's good. But when it's inordinate or when it's irrational or when it's an obstacle to learning or performance, we need to find ways to eliminate it. We need to find ways to remove those obstacles. One concept that you guys might be familiar with, stereotype threat. You familiar with stereotype threat? No, I'm surprised. It's actually a relatively new concept to me. One of my researchers introduced this concept to me. Stereotype threat is when an individual it self-identifies, and you know, in research they're sort of prompted to self-identify with a negative stereotype about people like them, and that results in lower achievement on a task or on an assessment. Lower achievement than they're actually capable of. And researchers have tested this by conducting experiments whereby they give two groups the same assessment. For example, two groups of females, the same math assessment. And one group is just given the assessment. The other group is given the assessment with some kind of prompt that either triggers or seeks to deflate a stereotype. And what the research has found is that you can eliminate the stereotype threat and thus raise students' performance to what they would normally do simply by telling students, for example, that this assessment has been designed to have indifference to gender, right? This assessment has been designed and has been evaluated so that there's no difference by gender or by race or anything like that. Now, that's helpful in a research setting. In a practical setting, in a classroom setting, a number of research studies have looked at ways that we can mediate this stereotype threat. And it looks like the best method of doing so is by teaching students that their intelligence is expandable, that their performance is not just reflective of how they were born, but their performance is up to them. Right? And we know that to be true. And this sounds a lot like a theory that you may have heard of called mindsets by Carol Dweck. So essentially, mindsets says that there tend to be a couple of different types of people. People who have a growth mindset and look at challenges as an opportunity to learn and to push themselves and to excel. And they look at failure or imperfection as feedback, as opposed to a fixed mindset where folks tend to think, okay, whatever intelligence I have, I'm born with, and I'm either smart or I'm not smart. And if I'm smart, things come easy to me, but if things are hard for me, it's probably because I'm not smart. So this can be a really sticky trap. What Dweck and others' research on mindsets has shown is that you can, in fact, teach students a growth mindset by explaining to them things about the brain and how neuroplasticity works and how effort and feedback and applying that feedback in practice leads to greater performance and results. And in doing so, you can raise students' performance level and increase their motivation. And as far as stereotype threat goes, there have been a couple of studies on this specifically, which show not only higher GPAs after teaching students about mindsets and asking them to apply their new knowledge of mindsets to a task, but also it can increase their self-reported enjoyment and the value that they put in schoolwork. Now, I think mindsets are really important because as we look at what assessments are there for, to measure learning, we also want to look at the role of assessments in learning itself. And we want to think about the fact that learning isn't just picking up a book and reading it, although that's one way of learning. Really effective learning and really strong and meaningful learning requires a lot of effort. And that a lot of students coming in from high school may have pretty simple methods of studying that don't go very deep and don't ensure that that knowledge is deeply held, but also available to them well into the future. It doesn't stick. So effort is super important in terms of learning, and having that mindset, that growth mindset that recognizes that effort results in performance, that's crucial. All right, how much of stress associated with assessments is really just because of the weight of those assessments? A lot of instructors may have a great proportion of the final grade balanced on the midterm or the final, whether it's an exam, paper, or project, or whatever. And I think that can create additional stress on students when there isn't sufficient feedback between the beginning of the course and the midterm and the final exam, because students begin to think that assessment itself is the goal, that midterm and that final exam is the goal, where in fact learning is the goal. Now, those kinds of assessments, those kinds of summative assessments, even if they are high stakes, can be critical, but we can help students be more successful and be less stressed about those assessments if we also make assessment a normal part of learning. And so, how many of you guys have low stakes or no stakes assessments in the courses that you teach, or if you work with faculty in the courses that they teach? Yeah, okay. A lot of you guys do this. It's great practice. You know, something that's easy to do in Canvas. It takes more work to set up a practice quiz than perhaps an open-ended essay. But if you can create it in a way that it gives students automatic feedback, and maybe so that there's more questions in a pool that students can be exposed to on repeated attempts, you're creating an opportunity for them to experience what your assessments might be like prior to a big, heavy exam. And it's also a way for them to get that feedback on their performance, for you to get some feedback on their performance prior to the things on which you're actually going to base their grade. Here's a really easy example. If you're using modules in Canvas, try having a self-check quiz early on in a lesson, maybe immediately after a reading, so students have an opportunity to apply what they've read and to put it into practice. And you may have an assessment at the end of the lesson as well. I don't think it's a bad idea to use the same pool of questions for both. Not only can that be a time-saving thing, right? You've got the questions for the quiz at the end of the lesson. You're using that same pool for the self-check. It helps students anticipate what they're actually going to be assessed upon. And in doing so, you're not saying, hey, you're going to memorize the letters of the answer choices. You're saying learning is an active part of what we do here. Another thing that we know is that, you know, as soon as somebody learns something, we tend to forget it, especially with recall and basic understanding. The best way to forestall that forgetting is to reintroduce the materials or get students to practice repeatedly. So creating multiple assessments throughout a course as opposed to one big one at the middle, one big one at the end, not only can reduce stress, but can ensure that students, not just through exposure, but through repeated practice, retain that information better, and can then collect those different pieces of information in their minds and make a more cohesive, synthesized whole. So here's an old example, one that I still love. You'll see in a lot of these examples, I recreated them. I didn't want to use other teachers' courses and, you know, accidentally expose a student. But Kurt Radford out of Utah State University, which is actually where I went to school, teaches American Sign Language. And he was super reluctant to begin teaching online or in a blended format just because so much of what his students did in the face-to-face classroom was practice and was physical. You know, sign language, physical, right? And you need to see and you need to do. But when he started using Canvas and discovered the embedded media recorder, he decided, you know what, I can make some quizzes that have essay questions, quote unquote essay questions, and prompt students to use the built-in media recorder to record themselves, you know, making signs. And that can be something that's not heavily weighted for the grade, in fact, maybe not graded at all, but has multiple attempts, so students have an opportunity to practice. And what I'll also do is I'll embed videos of myself or some of my teaching assistants in those essay prompts so that students are actually having to interpret what I say and answer back in that Canvas essay with video. Part of the value here is not just in the repetition, the opportunity to practice, and indeed the prompt to practice, but is in the interactivity. And as we saw before, a level of effort associated with learning is really going to impact students' retention and the depth to which they understand and are able to apply that knowledge. So Kurt loves this because not only is it enabling him to teach online and blended, but even in his face-to-face classes, now students have another mechanism through which they can practice. And in fact, he has turned the learning experience of a semester into something that's not just about coming to class where we practice, but practice can be an integral part of your day, and actually the work that you do outside of class is just as important as what we do inside of class. And I think that's related to this thing called the testing effect. Yeah, there are a lot of studies on this testing effect. Here's one example. The summary is that testing by itself seems to improve learning. More so than just reading or reviewing materials, taking a test, and that's what happened in this particular research study, taking a test reinforces your knowledge and encourages you as a learner to recall the information that you have been exposed to and put into practice, and that can be more powerful than just consuming. And that's why my second tip is let's find ways to turn assessment into active learning. We've already started going down that path, right? When I talked about de-stressing assessment, really my goal was to say we have to remove that obstacle of stress when it is an obstacle. And we can remove that obstacle by making an assessment a normal part of teaching and learning, really regular and almost routine to students. But let's also use assessment as a tool through which students can learn more. So active learning, I think it's similar to student-centered learning. It can be pretty vague and amorphous. When I think of active learning, I think about how our brains retain information the best. And I think it's not like we're building a muscle. It's not like we're pouring something into a container and it's just preserved perfectly. It's like we as learners have to make our way through the woods to a destination. And the more frequently we make our way through the woods to that destination, the more likely we will create a path in our minds that we can follow again and again and again. And the more we make that path, the more we practice, the more we retrieve, the clearer that path becomes and the easier it is to follow. So here's a really easy example of how you can create a kind of assessment that is active learning. Here, this is actually the introductory page of a lesson in Canvas. You can see the learning outcomes there at the top, the objectives at the top. Kind of a standard thing. But then what happens next is kind of interesting. The students are asked, before you begin this lesson for real, now that I've sort of introduced what we're going to be learning about, before you begin this lesson for real, reading or watching or whatever, make a list of questions that you have so that as you go through the reading, you can answer them. This not only creates a goal for the students to answer those questions, it makes that practice of reading, consuming information more active. Now, you can have students just do this on their own. You can teach them that this is a great way to learn. This is a good study practice. You could have it a requirement, have students turn it in as an assignment in Canvas. It doesn't have to be graded. Can be. Could be for extra credit, like I think in this case. But ask students to list out those questions and answer them as they go. Background knowledge is an important thing because oftentimes we don't fully know how much we understand a topic before we begin. And activating that background knowledge can help put the new information in context. But background knowledge by itself isn't perfect. Derek Muller, a researcher also out of Australia, coincidentally, did some work in his graduate studies on physics, looking at why it is that sometimes students can be taught a concept and still not understand it when the test or the quiz arrives. And what he found is that students who think they understand the topic can still be exposed to a correct interpretation or a correct explanation, and that may not change anything in their mind. If they think they know the answer already, it doesn't matter what you tell them. They're going to stick with their original understanding, and they're going to try to find a way of interpreting the new information in terms of what they already know. So activating background knowledge can be a good thing, but it can also be a detriment in this particular case if students have a misunderstanding of the topic. Now, in this research, Derek Muller, who now has a pretty cool YouTube channel called Veritasium, incorporated two ways of helping students confront any misunderstanding that they might have to make the learning experience more active. And first, he showed real people struggling to answer a real question. So before teaching the topic, he asked a question. He shows real people trying to answer the question, and some of them giving wrong answers. In fact, I think most of them giving wrong answers. So he starts with problems. He doesn't start with the answer. He doesn't start with the information. He starts with the question. And the way that he does it on YouTube, he'll create a video where he explains a physics problem and sets up a question. And if you kind of squint here, even in this video, he gives you 4 options there at the top. Here's a slinky. When I drop it, what's going to happen to the top and to the bottom? Are they going to, what part's going to fall first? Is the bottom going to fall first? Is the top going to fall first? Are they both going to fall together? Or do the ends approach each other? And then the video ends. And viewers, students, learners, are prompted to themselves respond to the challenge, how will the slinky fall? So they're asked to call upon their own understanding, their own interpretation, and expose that answer. And as I said, as part of this exercise, again, before giving the answer, Derek will expose students to other students and their interpretations and their ideas and their answers as a way of prompting each individual student to consider their own answer and that it might be wrong, and to compare it to others, so that when the right answer is finally given at the end, you may have broken down any kind of obstacles to a new understanding. You may have eroded the faith in the old misunderstanding and opened yourself up to learning. So this is done in his YouTube channel, which is kind of cool. Just one video, the question, and then you got to wait till the next video to see the answer. So you've got some space there. You could easily do this in Canvas just by, instead of presenting information in one video, splitting it up into 2, having the question between those 2 videos. It requires perhaps reworking the videos. But oftentimes, too, if you're using material from the web or from a publisher, videos usually have an introduction where they say, here's the problem, here's the case, here's the situation. And then they immediately tell you the answer, but that's where you could splice that. So I like this as actually part of discussions. So in this particular case, I've set up a discussion forum, and I've included part of a video that cuts short before the solution to the problem is actually revealed. And this is the Milgram study from psychology. And then what I did, and we can make this easier, but then what I did is I made the first response. Before I published the thing, I made the first response, and in the response, I put in the rest of the video. Except that I also asked another question at the end, so I would sort of seed the discussion with my first response. Well, what's the point? Students are just going to see the right answer, right? Well, there's nothing to force them to think about it. That's why you check the box in the discussion settings to say that students must post their reply first. So that, before they see your response, they're exposed to the problem, the question. You're prompting them to actually come up with their own answer and bravely post it to the discussion forum. As soon as they do so, the correct answer is revealed, as well as the other students' posts, and you can engage in a normal discussion. So this is a powerful way of not only assessing what students understand about a topic to begin with, or what they've understood from your lesson. It's a good way, I think, to help students begin to self-assess. And self-assess is such an important part of what we want to do in student-centered assessment. So here's another variation of that same idea. It's much simpler, I think. maybe a little bit more accessible. Going off of that original idea of using quizzes for low stakes or no stakes assessment, you can create something that's called a background knowledge probe. I don't like that name, probe sounds kind of scary. But a background knowledge probe is basically any kind of prompt to a learner to apply what they already know to questions, right? So in this case, it's just another quiz. It's got multiple choice questions, maybe the same ones that you would use in the self-check or the end of lesson quiz or whatever. Maybe some special ones to get students thinking about the topic. But the important part here in this particular example is that each content question is followed by a self-assessment question where you ask students to rate their confidence in the question they just answered. So students see a question, mark the answer, and then you ask them, how confident are you in your answer? Oftentimes this is a scale of 1 to 10. I like 3 options, right? Totally sure, kind of sure, not at all. The point here is not necessarily for you to gather information on what students know and are confident, although that's super helpful. It's, again, to get students to start to think about their own knowledge, their own understanding, and recognize where there are gaps that they'll need to fill as they work throughout the lesson. Here's another example. This is called the best summary. And this is one that is both active and, I think, relatively low stress because you're giving students an opportunity to express their understanding to their peers before they express their understanding to you. In a best summary assignment, you break students into groups, and in Canvas you can just use the groups mechanism to assign them. You might create a set of groups called the summary groups. But you break students into small groups, maybe 3 or 4, and then you give them an assignment. In this case, it's a group assignment. And the assignment is, for the lesson or the reading or the video or whatever they just consumed, write a summary. Each of you individually write your own summary, whatever specifications you want to give them for the summary. It's either 140 characters or it's complete or whatever you want to say. It's up to you. And then you have the students share their summaries with their group members. And the group members collectively, collaboratively, identify the best summary. And that's the summary that the group submits to you to represent their effort. Now, it may be that there's one student in the group who's just got the best summary, and that's what's submitted. But what tends to happen is that once students actually share their own summaries with each other, a student's going to like their summary, and there's going to be some discussion, there's going to be some debate, and likely what's going to happen is that the resulting best summary is a collection or a collaborative work from the group. It's the best parts of all of the summaries because some students will say, oh, you forgot about this part, and other students will say, yeah, but yours is way too wordy, it needs to be shorter, right? So by working in a group, they can not only ensure that they have understanding of the topic, summarize and synthesize it, and work together to make sure that it represents their collective knowledge. It's a super easy activity to implement. In this case, I have a rubric. It's really simple. You can't really see it. The 2 criteria on the rubric are the summary is accurate, and the other one's not showing there, is it? The summary is accurate and the summary is complete. So accurate and completeness. It can be as simple as that. And so in this case, absolutely using a group assignments, assign students to groups. You can even do that as you create the assignment. And that way, only one student from the group needs to make the submission. Now, as far as how students do this themselves, I think you can largely leave it up to them. Maybe you set aside some time during the face-to-face class session for them to look at each other's summaries and evaluate them and choose one. But I don't think that's a really great use of class time. That's something that you can have them do online when not everybody is in a room that costs a lot of money to keep the lights and internet on. You can have them working in groups in Canvas. They might choose to use collaborations and just author a Google Doc where they paste stuff in or type stuff in and compare. You might just have them use a discussion forum in groups. I think you just leave it up to them. Let them know that the tools are available and what tools are available, and they'll figure it out. And then what you take in terms of a submission, it could be a Word doc, it could be the collaboration itself. It could be, again, something that you just put into a discussion forum. So you create a discussion forum with the exact same prompt and have students as a group decide upon and then share to that discussion forum so that the rest of the class can see. And here also I'm using that post-first setting so that the summaries are not visible to students before the groups post. I like those examples because getting students to work together feels a little bit more authentic. It feels a little bit more like the kind of work that they'll probably be doing when they leave the classroom and they start working in their careers. You know, at Instructure, we do a ton of collaborative work. And we oftentimes look at each other's work in terms of assessment and evaluation. We just don't call it that, right? We want to make sure that the things that we do are super high quality, so we call it QA in terms of engineering, right? Or copy review when it comes to things that we write. But authentic assessment in general is something that we can all start doing in our classes to make the assessments and the learning activities a little more meaningful. So authentic, means real world. It means that we're either using resources and materials from the real world, from media or from news or from active discussions on the web, and introducing those to our students to help them learn and grow. And when we look at assessments that are authentic, we're looking at ways in which the students' work represents the kind of work that we would expect them to do when our class is over, whether they're going on to grad school or graduating and entering the workforce. Now, my favorite kinds of authentic activities are the ones where students are encouraged to take on a real-world role. And I think in lower-level courses, in freshman and sophomore level courses, that can be fantastic for students because they're still exploring all of the different options in their career, or in their academic career, and figuring out what learning path is best for them. So authentic activities that prompt students to take on a new role, to try things out, to shift from being the student of the teacher to being, even if just for a week or two, a writer or an engineer or an entrepreneur or a scientist. It helps them think like a professional. It helps them develop their own metacognition. And I think it creates some additional motivation for them to engage in the learning activities because they see its relevance. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are doing authentic assessments by having students create, present, share, or operate in a lab environment, perform, demonstrate their developing skills. Something that's kind of simple, but a lot of folks don't think about, is that in those situations where you're in a live setting and you're observing students performing or presenting or whatever, or practicing a skill, even doing lab work, you could open up SpeedGrader on the iPad, and for each student, you could have a rubric, you tap through the criteria. You could even use the comments thing to the comments section, the comments section to record video of them in that moment. And that becomes your quote-unquote feedback. You're actually observing the student, and your feedback to them is a complete reflection of the work that they were doing. So you create an assignment that doesn't have any submissions, of course, because unless you want students to submit the artifact of the resulting lab work or performance or whatever, but you can just create a no submission assignment and get to work on this, recording students in that live environment. Here's another example. Wikipedia, it's this giant encyclopedia that's crowdsourced, contributed to folks around the world. Sometimes it's awesome, sometimes it's not. The Wikipedia education program has the goal of getting educators and their students involved in maintaining and improving Wikipedia. And this is an idea that goes way back. I think I first saw this maybe 7 or 8 years ago, where an instructor had their students choose a Wikipedia article related to the course topic that was underdeveloped or incorrect or maybe even just absent, and collectively author, improve, revise whatever needed to happen to that article. So the Wikipedia education program is a great way to find out about some of these opportunities, to engage your students in the act of authoring or improving Wikipedia articles. And in Canvas, of course, you can create an assignment that has, instead of a file submission, a URL submission, which is really great for these kinds of works because students can then share the URL of their Wikipedia contributions page, the page that shows all of the edits that they've made. And that's available for you. You can go out to Wikipedia if you want from the hyperlink, but what Canvas does is it takes a screenshot of that web page at that point in time, puts it in SpeedGrader, so that you can score them, give them feedback, use a rubric, whatever you want, and students don't have to do anything else. They don't have to submit anything except for that URL. Their work is just there on the web. This is an example of what David Wiley calls renewable assignments, as opposed to disposable assignments. So a disposable assignment, it's representative of a lot of work that we've probably done in our lives where you do a test, you do a paper, nobody sees it beyond the instructor, and it's really destined for the wastebasket. And that's because as a student, you maybe don't see the value of that work, or it hasn't been explained to you how that work can have impact beyond the grade that students receive. So with the Wikipedia assignment, with the Wikipedia example, students are actually creating something that persists beyond the term of the semester, and they're creating something that will be seen by more people than just their instructor or their classmates. And it's the sort of thing that can be renewed, refreshed semester after semester and built upon. An example from David Wiley's own courses that he has taught is the Project Management for Instructional Design course, where he actually had the students author a book on project management for instructional design. He didn't want them to have to buy a textbook. He knew that they needed to fully understand and apply this information, discover what the best practices were in project management. So why not have them research and compile and summarize and synthesize and produce, actually create a work that then can be built upon and shared with others. And a key component here of a renewable assignment is the open licensing. Here we have a Creative Commons license on this work so that not only can people who do discover the students' work use it freely, reuse it with their students, but it can also be built upon. It can also be continuously improved semester after semester. It's a really great example of authentic assessment because there's a learning activity, there is an assessment component, but the work lives beyond the term of the semester, and students can start to see the meaningfulness of their work and experience a kind of joy, or as Philip Pullman writes, a delight that can coexist. This is the lesson that Philip Pullman learned from his teachers that he remembered the most, that learning has a responsibility. Learning is effort, learning is work. It's a responsibility, but it's not just pain. It actually has a delightful component to it. And that's something I think we can help our students realize. Here's one last example to help get us there. Again, super simple. I started with a question, why do students care about assessment? And here, we're actually asking them to answer that question. Here, this is just any assignment. Forget what the assignment is. It's literary analysis first draft. It doesn't matter. In any given assignments, you can ask your students, why are you doing this assignment? Why did I, as the instructor, require you to do this? Prompt them to think about not only how this assignment might relate to course objectives or their grades, but to go beyond that. Why did you assign them this work? What is the requirement for them supposed to do? I think with this simple question, we can have students begin to uncover the meaning of assessments and the purpose of learning and how those two are connected, and to think beyond the grade toward a motivation to self-assess and to learn and to put in the effort that's required for meaningful learning. So those are the three ideas that I wanted to share with you guys, and some applications in Canvas: de-stressing assessments, turning assessments into active learning, and making assessments authentic and meaningful. I need to do a quick time check. If we have time, I want to show you guys a quick preview of new quizzes, and Jennifer's giving me the thumbs up. So how much time do we have?
15 minutes.
We have 15 minutes, which is perfect. Okay, so we're going to shift gears, give you a little bit of previews of quizzes 2 or quizzes next. So quizzes 2. So Canvas has quizzes. Some of you have used them. I'm not going to ask who doesn't like or is frustrated, but I will ask who loves the quizzes tool on Canvas. Well, don't make me sad. It's good. It's okay. I've seen worse. I've worked with a lot of different LMSs. I've seen worse. But we know there's some things that are not awesome with the current quizzes, and we've seen and heard a lot of opportunities to improve. And this is a really big undertaking to take the quizzing engine, which is a staple of many courses, and in fact has to be super reliable for a lot of courses, and rebuild it, reinvent it. So what we did with quizzes is we didn't just improve the existing quizzes engine. We started from scratch. Now, one caveat, or maybe a regret, I suppose, we started talking about quizzes 2 or quizzes next last summer at InstructureCon, and that's like way earlier than we ever normally talk about anything new in Canvas, because we don't want folks just waiting and indefinitely wondering, when is this going to come out? When is this going to come out? But we did that because we knew that the development of quizzes would take a lot of time, and that it really, really required a lot of feedback and testing by the community so that we got it right. So, you know, we talked about quizzes.next last summer at InstructureCon. A lot of folks have been asking me since then, well, when's it going to be done? When's it going to be released? I thought it was going to be soon, because that's what we typically do. We were like, hey, here's a new thing, and it's done, or it's in beta, or you know, whatever. In this case, we knew it would be about a year before it was done, but we needed to start collecting that feedback. So, baked from scratch, right? We started over completely. It's entirely new code from the ground up. And here are some of our goals for quizzes.next. It needs to be more scalable, especially for really, really large courses. It's not as much about performance for the student in the course. It's really more about the results of the course. So scalability is number one. Making it simpler and easier, so that for those of you who use quizzes a lot or create a lot of exams, you can get your work done faster. And for instructors who maybe don't use online quizzes, it's easier for them to learn and to get started, and it's actually encouraging for them rather than discouraging, because it's not obvious how they go about building. More efficient, lots of time savings in there, and then make learning more visible, of course. You know, we want to facilitate assessments that help represent what students understand and can do, and then to take that data and make it more visible to you and more interpretable to you. All right, so whole new interface, nice, clean, easy to use. Yeah, I'll just let you look at that for a moment. And then we'll talk about some specific things. Here's a multiple choice question editor. What can you see that's new here? Can you see anything that's new? I'm sorry if it's small or faded out. Anybody see anything new? What's new? Yeah, ability to add different points to different answer choices or options. Different points to different options. They don't have to all be worth the same point value, although they can be. Anything else? Align to outcomes. Yeah, currently you can align a question bank to one or more learning outcomes, and students' performance on those questions is represented in outcomes. I like that from an instructional design perspective, but I think for most instructors, it's just much easier, and it makes a lot more sense to take a single question or several questions and align them directly with one or more outcomes. Okay, here's a view of a true-false question. But it's a smarter question option. It's not just true, false. You can easily toggle between a number of different choices in terms of what's represented to the students. Here it's true, false, right? But it might be yes, no. It might be agree, disagree, or you might choose your own values for those. And there's that vary points by answer option. If you mark the wrong answer, you actually get penalized. You mark the right answer, you get 2 points. So that's an option, as well as, as you pointed out, the ability to align one or more questions to outcomes, one or more outcomes. Here's matching. Not a ton new here, although you'll notice that you can choose from a couple of different formats for your matching questions. The standard drop-down menu, so students choose the match from a drop-down, or a word cloud option, where students are finding the options, the words in a sort of cloud presentation. It's kind of fun. So yeah, there are all of the standard question types and a number of new ones. The most popular question types requested on the community, given to us in direct feedback. We've got categorization, fill in the blank, hotspot. Everybody loves hotspot. And then an ordering variation as well. I'll show you a few of those. Here's categorization. Match the name of the celestial body on the left with its correct classification. This is very much like matching, but can be a little bit more logical to students in terms of the actual task that they're doing, which is categorizing terms or information and representing their ability to organize that knowledge. Ordering, here we have a paragraph. Notice those cute little handles next to sentences. This is changing the order of sentences in a paragraph to represent maybe the most logical flow. In this case, it's sort of recall of what's actually in the Gettysburg Address. So there's a lot of different applications here, not just for memorizing, but also for sequencing and putting things in that logical order, and maybe even analyzing a specific situation or case and choosing which things you would do in which order. And I'll tell you, a lot of quiz questions can feel kind of artificial, but in the work that I do, in my team, this sort of thing is very, very real. When one of my team members who's maybe junior is given a problem or given a challenge or given a task or given a project, I want to make sure that she goes about it in the most efficient way and in the right way. And the sequence of steps matters, and the substance of those steps matters, but definitely the sequence. Hey, easier short answer / fill in the blank. So fill in the blank is kind of a new question type. I mean, you can do it in Canvas today. But this one, short answer, fill in the blank. You'll notice here the answer type on both of these blanks is open entry, although it could be selected from a list, like a closed type question. Yes, and so you just create blank spaces by highlighting the words in your sentence. So you would actually have the sentence just there as the question. You select the ones that you want, you highlight the ones that you want to be the answer choices rather than having to type anything special in and turn those into blanks. Oh, hey, text match. Yeah, it's kind of hard to come up with all of the different variations that you want to accept for a short answer. And in learning management systems that I've worked with in the past, the best solution has been regular expressions. Even just saying that word fills me with a little bit of fear. Yes, sir?
With regards to the ordering and categorizing,
Yeah.
it looks like they were dragging and dropping. With respect to accessibility,
Yes.
is there a keyboard shortcut?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, so the question was, with respect to dragging and dropping and organization, categorization, will it be accessible? Yes, absolutely. And to that point, we've gone to a lot of pain an effort over the last couple of years to ensure that any interface, any interaction that involves drag and drop is accessible and more intuitive and more efficient for folks who might be using keyboard to navigate. Yes. Okay, not regular expressions here. We're using this thing, we're using this thing called the Stein distance, which is a way of very simply saying what kind of tolerance you would like to give to this answer choice. So regular expression, who's familiar with regular expression? Who's ever tried to do one? There's some computer science people in here and maybe some folks who have totally nerded out on the LMS. Regular expression is a way of saying this word with maybe this character uppercase or lowercase, and maybe any number of these characters in the middle, and maybe this one I don't care about whether it's there or not. What we decided to use is this thing called Stein distance, which is super simple. So if the answer is onomatopoeia, and you want to let students capitalize or not capitalize, but spelling has to be right, you might have a Stein distance of just 1. Or, check that box that says ignore case. But if you don't care so much about spelling, you might increase that number to allow for different variations. So it's one of those things that does take a little bit of learning to comprehend at first, but makes this kind of evaluation so much simpler. All right, I'm running out of time, so let me go pretty quickly here. Smarter open-ended essay questions. A couple of things to highlight here. That's the essay question editor. You can decide now if you want the rich content editor on or off, which means that they either do or don't have access to rich content editor LTI tools. Most browsers today have spell check built in, but we decided to allow it specifically as a service on essay questions if you want, show word counts, and also set a minimum and maximum word count. Set some guardrails for students as well as that word count feedback so they know how they're doing. As far as the feedback itself, of course, every question allows you to enter some feedback that's automatically presented to the students. This new option called grading notes is for you or your TAs or your co-instructors. It's only shown to you, and I'll display where that actually appears. So these are notes to yourself on how you would assess this. Maybe it's a model answer that you would compare against. Oh yeah, and it's going to work in SpeedGrader, of course. Hey, SpeedGrader. So this is just what it looks like in SpeedGrader. I wanted to include this really just to show you how those grading notes appear when you are assessing students' work in SpeedGrader. So here, the blue box represents the student's response to the essay question. The gray box right below, those are your grading notes. Those are the things that you put down for yourself to refer to as you are assessing the student work. Item analysis. I was going to title this slide, Item Analysis Made Easy. I don't know if that's possible, so we're going to make it easier. And this is reflective of some of the work we've already done in terms of taking the data and statistics on quiz attempts and representing it so that you can quickly and easily make sense of it. Here we have the histogram with the representation of individual, of the students as they fall into performance categories. And some of those basic descriptive statistics at the top. Averages, medians, low, high, etc. And here's where the actual item analysis is represented. So I don't want to get into this too much, but item analysis is a way for you to understand how difficult a given question is for students as a whole, and also how well a given question how well a given question discriminates, right? Like that's usually a pejorative, but here we're talking about how well a question identifies or classifies students according to their overall performance on the assessment. So item analysis is an important tool for instructors who actually care about using quantitative assessments, quizzes, and exams where their questions are effective and reliable. So we're making that easier to understand, and hopefully that will prompt you when there's a question that needs some work or attention or isn't assessing students properly. Okay, assessment settings. Man, we got to have a lot of settings for an assessment for quizzes. There are so many different ways to incorporate this as summative or formative with ProCpassor. So let me highlight how we're making some of these easier. The first item, shuffle questions globally throughout the whole assessment. So today, you can do question shuffling within what we call question groups. Here, we're turning it into just a toggle for the whole thing. So if you don't want to deal with those question groups. Time limits, one question at a time. All the rest of this stuff is pretty straightforward. Okay, some additional options though down below. In addition to the standard options and perhaps a little bit more flexibility in terms of allowing participants viewing of the response, you'll notice that we're adding an additional access code. So sometimes there's going to be a student access code, and that can be manually or automatically generated. That's just something that the student themselves knows and enters in order to access the quiz. And sometimes you want to have a proctor access code, a more secure access code that's only shared with testing centers or remote proctoring locations. We figured it would be important to have that flexibility so you could do either or both. And of course, it will work on mobile apps. So this is a mock-up, but actually, literally just yesterday, Jason Sparks, who's the senior product manager over this project, sent me this screenshot, live test of Quizzes 2 in the mobile app, works fine, great, encouraging. And so that's kind of where we're at now. We've had code available to select users and in a focus group for about 6 months now, I think. We're continuing to do that testing. There's still more design work to do. It's really a tremendous undertaking. I don't usually like to use clip art, but man, these people just seem so happy. And I want to represent how our aim is to make quizzes something that you guys want to use and that allows you to create more meaningful assessments for your students, whether they are more traditional summative assessments or you're incorporating a lot of low stakes formative assessments throughout the semester and getting creative in how you're encouraging students to engage in active learning. So that's what we got for quizzes. I'll happily take questions on quizzes with the disclaimer that Jason Sparks knows way more about this than I do, and if it's very specific, I may just say, I don't know, but shoot us an email.